Good morning, everyone, and welcome to all of you, ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to welcome here our guests here in the studio that I'm going to introduce to you very soon. I'd like to welcome all the different speakers from remote, and I'd like to also welcome all those who are following us on our website. You can find the program of all events during this European Week of Security. These working sessions are streamed online, and they can be in English, Italian, and French. On the website, you have also a chat. You can send your questions through this chat related to the topics that we have tackled during this morning session. So if we have time, so we can give you an answer in real time. Otherwise, you're going to get an answer after this European Week of Security, and the experts will do that. You'll find all the contents on the official site of Pacte Sur, www.pactesur.eu. About the Pacte Sur project, I'd like to remind all of you that it is a very important project. It is a bottom-up approach that is aiming at strengthening capabilities of local institutions, local authorities, and non-conventional stakeholders on urban security. How do they do that? They do that through different activities. For example, the implementation of different activities, training courses, and also national and transnational cross-border activities and programs. The Pacte Sur project includes three different main cities: Nice, Turin, and Liège. But then we have also another 11 cities that belong to the EFUS program, so European Fund for Urban Security. This is the third day of this European Week of Security. This is the most important moment for this project all over the year. This is the second year we've been organizing this event after Nice 2019. We have dealt with the different topics: communication, technological innovation applied to integrated and participatory security. And this morning's session is instead focused on menaces, threats, new threats that can emerge from virtual spaces and also from the lockdown period due to the pandemic. Of course, the lockdown was an extremely difficult situation for the whole population. Isolation, physical and social isolation, together with the fact of always being in contact with technology because we all worked from home, from remote, in smart working modalities. So we all had to interact with a virtual world, with technology. This has totally changed our social, relational, and personal balances. This has particularly impacted our health. I mean here psychophysiological health of people. These are all factors that are combined with the emergency stress and the lack of knowledge about our future. And this has spurred negative situations, and they can also then feed different situations: radicalization, social hatred, and so on. Online, we do see that these are direct consequences of isolation and lockdown. We're going to talk about that together with our guests here in the studio. I'd like to introduce them to you very quickly. Here in the middle, we have Mr. Edoardo Mattello, expert of ENG Piemonte for urban security. He's been quite known so far. He's been here for 3 days. He has a long experience in the armed force of the Italian army. He's an expert of military law and urban security. We have today with us also Mr. Guglielmetti, member of the organization and security network set up by the European Commission. And he's also co-founder of the Italian group of terrorist studies. He is also a teacher in the master focusing on international security and fight against terrorism. Would like to thank you very much for your participation, first and foremost. And I think we can go over directly to a real factual discussion. So, Luca, what about this lockdown and isolation? What was the meaning of that, and what are its consequences? Thank you, Isabella. I'd like to thank you very much. Let's start with very practical aspects. What I have been facing during my professional life. I'm going to mention another European project. It's not because of competition reasons. This is a parallel project, ECCU, that is particularly important for Turin, that involves many different civil societies examples. It comes down to radicalization. So not only all those who are leading extremist groups, but any form of well-organized violent groups. In February, before the outbreak of the pandemic, I say this just because I wanted to show you the threats coming from this pandemic. Well, in February, as I was saying, so we were starting a kind of secondary prevention activity with risk groups in some critical classes of a high school in the province Turin, where there were some critical situations, bullying, small crime in a quite critical social situation. And after 2 meetings, we had to interrupt this kind of activity. Just like all Italian and European schools, we all went over to the so-called remote education, so the so-called homeschooling. But the concrete result is well known. The fact was that not everyone, not all students could follow this homeschooling, and the fact that many students also dropped out during these months. It is a threat. Is it true or not? Yes, it is a threat, it is a menace, so we have to assess that. Anyway, this is not a positive sign, because we have more people dropping out because of a social-technological gap among students. Something similar happened for jail, because it was the second year trying to work with minors in jail in Turin, especially for a re-educational, rehabilitating activity, so that they could be reintroduced into society after jail, after imprisonment. So because of the lockdown, all these activities were interrupted. Everything was interrupted. All young people in jail played all these lockdown months football in jail. Now they have resumed some activities, but now we have some other challenges. This can be also a threat, because if you give up rehabilitation activities with young convicts that fortunately have a short stay in jail, have short penalties, well, this may happen that they can go back to their crime. It's much more probable than if we were then giving them a particular activity. This was interrupted because of pandemic. I'd like also to remind you that their rehabilitation is based on a constitutional right, and school is also a constitutional right. So this pandemic has interrupted institutional rights, and on the other side, it's also then generating potential threats. There are some other problems we haven't talked so much about. because at the beginning of the lockdown period, since I could not carry out these activities in the European project, I had to deal with the emergency psychologists. These psychologists are the ones that are healing traumas in case of earthquakes, terrorist attacks, and so on. What is now the novelty in this pandemic? A therapeutical helper, a therapeutical assistant that was answering a phone call for all those who were calling and asking for help because a family member had died because they were scared of pandemic, and you know that the situation was very sad because there were no funerals. It was almost impossible to communicate with all people that were hospitalized. Well, all this important role played by the emergency psychologist had a totally different situation. The psychologist himself or herself was embedded in the pandemic. So how am I going to face this particular crisis? It is not the classical case where those who step in, so just for example, the therapeutical assistant knows how to help people. But we have also then a problem in an approach. The paradigm is changing. So all those who are given help, so we have also to understand what the pandemic is. But then we have also a prosemic problem because the therapeutical activities, help, a kind of assistance, well, may begin, for example, on a phone call line as a kind of first response, but then any kind of therapeutical activity, just like education activities, just all mentoring, counseling activities, prevention activities, rehabilitation activities, do require a physical presence. And so they require to transform this kind of activities into a social distancing situation. Or maybe just like now through remote connections, through call conferences. These are challenges that combine prosemic and national aspects, but also technological aspects. So because am I going to convey my emotions to all of you that have dialed in through a computer? And so when you have to build secure and sound relationships, so conveying security to people that are scared, and also then helping people that need to be rehabilitated because they need to believe in their future when they get out of school, they get out of jail. Well, these are challenges that we need to meet because otherwise they can be turned into menaces, as the subject matter of today's discussion. I am saying that because we are facing this topic not only here in the second European Week of Security with the Apparatus project, even in some other situations in Iran. There's today a plenary session. Iran is a network of networks made up of all different operators that are dealing with the prevention and radicalization all over Europe. Local police, social assistants, social workers, teachers, politicians, and so on. Well, here too, the topic is how to adapt locally the prevention and fight against radicalization, which means much more than just fight against terrorism, because it means that we have to work at the roots of this phenomenon. The problem means also to work on people. It means to work on victims. As yesterday we heard from Nice when they were talking about their city's experience. How can we perform all these activities during pandemic? This has been quite a challenge, and this requires also a change in our relations with technology, with the remote connections, with social distancing. And so probably we can say that for us, Mediterranean countries, there's a particular pain because we need to help us. You need to pad us on shoulders. So it's a real challenge for all of us. But pandemic is also stressing out another problem. For the first time, I had to receive messages, conspiring messages, something that we already heard. Mr. Mattiello already said it before. So this is one of the novelties that we can see from this virtual environment. Together with fake news, this is quite a problem. This is a fake news situation which is embedded in an ideological narrative. It's a kind of consistent narrative, as we think. They try to give an answer to pandemic through a conspiring theory. This aspect is for sure significant and also difficult to analyze, but also it's difficult to analyze these results, because it is hard, even if it's normally related to extreme right movements, just like in the case of American clans, because the conspiracy theory in America is quite restrained, quite limited. But when we talk in general about G5, there might be some people that politically oriented on the left and on the right side of the parliament, of course, no matter what. This is quite a difficult thing to analyze. But we have, of course, to deal with the different consequences of this pandemic. This is quite important, especially at local level. I'd like to give an example based on my experience. Sorry if you couldn't find it in my resume, but when you get a bit old, it's quite difficult to remember everything. So I dealt with radicalization and prevention because I first dealt with terrorist victims. What does this have to do? Normally, I want to see what happens in victims. So what happened in the COVID victims is something that we neglected, and if we neglect it, it can become a threat. There were mistakes, as you know. We are in a totally new situation, especially for the Western world. This kind of pandemic was totally new, was a novelty, but this meant also particularly dramatic situation. Just like in the Bergamo and Brescia area. These are the two most struck Italian clusters where there was the highest incident rate of pandemic victims and deaths and casualties. This did not only brought about actions by the legal system, by the police, because of different choices at national and local level. But I think that this resentment of the victims' parents have then generated associations that wanted to fund their casualties' memory. And they want to know the truth. I already saw that for terrorist attacks victims. They did not get the whole truth. They got just a partial truth, just a legal judiciary truth. This is also an aspect that we cannot neglect. For instance, I have seen that these victims have been neglected. We did not commemorate them so much. We saw that just in Brescia. We didn't have any public deed by the Prime Minister, by the President of the Republic. I think this is also quite important and significant in order to prevent social cohesion from fading away, fading apart, because if we have many victims, this means a loss in social cohesion, just like when we go to school and then we do not go to school anymore due to lockdown periods or many other situations due to the pandemic crisis. Well, this was my experience. I wanted to stress out all that. These are threats, menaces, but particularly these are challenges. These are challenges that cities and city administrations and different stakeholders need to meet. We all need to cooperate. As for prevention and radicalization actions, we need, of course, the support of the local police, and the local police needs to work with social workers and with all those who are dealing with mental health, with the educational system, but also with the jail system in order to give positive answers to such challenges. This goes beyond, of course, the commitment and the political will of public decision makers and politicians. But I believe that at local level, because the local approach is essential against radicalization, one of the best practices in this case against terrorism, and Eduardo is going to deep dive this topic, one of the best practices that we can find in Europe is in Aarhus in Denmark, where the local police had a multidisciplinary approach. We had the city with all its services, educational system, and intelligence. So they were able to reduce the foreign fighters in a matter of 1 year. So foreign fighters, which means people leaving from that country, going to Iraq, to Syria, to this war in the Middle East. So from hundreds of people, they came down to dozens of people. So radicalization has normally local roots. Essentially, it's always like that. It's true we have an international geopolitical conflict, but clusters are at local level. So people that are recruited or self-recruited are always locally based, because the recruiter maybe is local because probably they have particular conditions, so crisis, multi-factor situations. There are, for example, young people that are attracted by propaganda. And so, therefore, local city administrators need to play an essential role. This is, for example, present, for example, in Aram as well, so local authorities. But we have also done a European network, the so-called Strong Cities Network. It's been set up some years ago, and it is like a ethos. It's just like the consortium of the Pacte Sur project. This is also a network that is tackling urban security against violent extremism. I stuck to my time framework, just 15 minutes. I'll stop here. So, good, wonderful. So now we have time to have Eduardo talking about this topic. But, of course, from the point of view of terrorism, what this kind of change could mean, what this kind of lockdown period could cause. Thank you very much, Luca. This has been a very interesting and a very positive speech and presentation. I'd like to go back to what my colleague just said. What I've always done in my life, so I tried to be in the shoes of the others. So this time in the shoes of a terrorist in a pandemic crisis period. So I'm going back now to the different topics that Luca, my colleague, was mentioning in his presentation. Bottom line. So what is the terrorist aiming at? Terrorists want to create an identity within their group. So they want to say, we are right and all the others are wrong. So this means that they want to create the concept of other. So a terrorist group that is right and the remaining people that are wrong. So the absolute enemy. It is legal, it is feasible to do everything against this enemy because they are wrong. So terrorism is working in absolute terms. The thing that terrorism is scared of the most is, of course, the dialogue, because when you have a dialogue, this absolute enemy starts disappearing. In a pandemic context, and I'm talking here about my personal experience, in a pandemic period, when there's a lockdown, well, what happens to people? People are alone by themselves. They are deprived of their routines, their patterns, their life rhythms, so that they can really perceive themselves in a different way. So they have no perception about their future. They do not have particular supports, just like going to the cafe to get a coffee together with their friends, where they can meet other people, or maybe without having a smile on the student's face, or maybe then trying to tell off a student that was not behaving well. This is just, of course, a joke. So without this kind of support, this kind of gratification, actions are now missing during a lockdown period. People during a lockdown are basically locked in an apartment, in a house, in a building. They do not know what the future looks like. Through different media with burning terms, because we know that the war words and war expressions used by all media were terrible. And, you know, there was a total confusion as for information sources. I remember at the beginning of the lockdown period, I organized, together with my colleagues, a kind of information analysis cell. So a group. We analyzed all the information produced in the social media, in the network, in order to understand what was the real state of the art as for information. So real dangers for the virus, real number of deaths, of sick people. So how the world was working that period, just because there were some contradictory information. There was an expert saying something, the World Health Organization said the opposite thing, but then the World Health Organization said, I said that, but I wanted to say something else, and so on and so forth. This happened in a context where a lockdown requires a kind of passive approach to people that suffer from it, because we tell people to stay at home. And somehow people are feeling a kind of victim, a victim that is subject to some others. These others, of this other situation, well, we do not know what they are. There's not an enemy with a particular uniform going around the city. No, it can be maybe a dormant enemy. So, in such a context, as Mr. Professor Guglielminetti was mentioning earlier, a terrorist can easily identify the other, so which means the other as perceived by the terrorist, in a vacuum that has been caused by this confusion. In my right-wing extremists, I'll say that COVID is then brought into the country by migrants. Not only that, Professor was saying before that people were calling the psychological assistance help, and I expect to have, for example, some help. The other person is also living in a different situation, and I cannot see the other person on the other line, and I cannot start any therapy. As an extremist, I always make the example of right-wing movements, but can be also any other kind of extremist movements, where this right movement extremists show themselves very clearly, very strong, they are very strong, they have a very clear stand on what is happening, and somehow I'm finding a supporter. This will mean that these people are not always terrorists, but they will legitimate their ideas in a very clear and a practical and operational way. If I'm a jihadist, let's take the example of Daesh. Daesh is not the only jihadist movement, but it's like a company in terms of branding. So Daesh was very good in media campaign, and here media were here playing a prevailing role. So let's say if I belong to Daesh, what am I going to do? So before the pandemic, I already have a recruitment system that is not showing how I am perpetrating violent attacks, how I am bad, how I am violent. Not at all. First of all, we have an identity approach, given values, given a kind of feeling of belonging to a particular world, to a particular area. So they give a moral vision, starting from which they can draw some consequences. These consequences, of course, not moral. They're just aimed at a better world according to their perception. So they tell people, if you kill 5 people, you're good, but you're better if you kill 100 people. But the bait of such movements is like that. So it's not saying we are bad, we are fierce, we are violent. Not at all. All those who are in doubt will find Daesh, for example, that says, have you seen what has happened? Have you seen how our society is deprived? COVID has sent COVID to punish us. COVID is just an expression of God's actions to punish the bad ones. We, the good ones, so Daesh, are giving you a response so that this will not happen anymore. And then Daesh is producing then a poster, just like the World Health Organization, and disseminates it. And they say, we are good, COVID is fighting for us, but please do not come to our countries because we are scared of COVID. We do not want it to be infected. Of course, they are good, but of course, I do not feel so well.
So, in this kind of situation, what is happening? I'd say that certain movements find some supporters because they are not so against that movement. In another context, for example, the context that the professor was mentioning, if we find a group with some profound resentment, and I don't want to mention the relatives of the victims, but if we take people who used to live a bad situation and they find themselves living an even worse situation, then if they find themselves hearing a voice saying, you will find something more positive and I will help you, this person will be probably will commit something very bad. So in this moment, the Daesh movement wants to make clear that it is right to attack hospitals and supermarkets. It is proposing tax proposals, so they are saying if you have the COVID-19, then you have to sneeze in front of your teacher, in front of the police forces. So in front of this threat, which I'd say it's a bit ridiculous in this pandemic context, what is the consequence of these threats? They work with the violence. They work with the emotional violence. Why do they say you have to attack your teacher? They are symbols of pandemic attacks. In this context, it is important to understand how the pandemic had a consequence on the terrorist threat. Thank you. Well, Eduardo, you're saying we should be very worried. From a certain point of view, this is very different, very important and topic for us. It's an important reflection. So as citizens that is hearing your speech could be more calm. Well, the citizens must take into account that the resilience is the strength point that we have to consider in this crisis movement, and in order to ave the crisis, it is important to fight against the obstacle. We've had worse obstacles in our lives than the COVID-19, and we have always tried, and we managed to face these obstacles. We don't have to underestimate the situation, and it is very difficult in this kind of moments to stay strong, but I am sure that we will make it. As we were saying yesterday, it's all about a positive and constructive resilience. That's our recommendation for all the people who are hearing us in order to develop a constructive behavior, and that will certainly help. Now we will explore other aspects of this criticisms with the Professor Daniel Trottier. He is an associate professor at the Department of Medium and Communication of the Erasmus University of Rotterdam. His postdoc research was on digital media for scrutiny, complaint, and shaming, and he has done a new research that is the use of social media for shaming. So this research is really similar to the topic that we've just talked about. He is developing a 5-year project on digital media in order to assess the social impacts. He will talk about these themes during his speech. Welcome, Daniel. I can see you on the screen. I'd say everything is ready. Good morning, Daniel, and welcome. Buongiorno.
Now you can also see the slides. Good morning, everybody. So what I'd like to discuss today is civilian self-policing. As you heard, this is a research topic that I've been focusing on, and specifically the impact that the pandemic and the lockdowns or the semi-lockdowns or the intelligent lockdowns have had on citizens and civilians policing each other. This is a topic I think we're all very familiar with in our personal lives, so I don't think I need to stress the societal relevance. But just as an introduction, very recently with the second wave coming up in Europe, including Amsterdam, the mayor of Amsterdam has asked residents to let local authorities know in case there is parties with the neighbors or other sorts of large gatherings that need to be reported. Under normal circumstances, this would be a very controversial decision and would spark issues in terms of abuse or in terms of civil rights. It's a lot more acceptable these days for reasons you understand. Independent of what we see happening at the level of municipalities and local authorities, we also see, independent of those authorities, but dependent on digital platforms like Facebook, Instagram, and in this case, Reddit, you see citizens denouncing each other. I think if you recall the toilet paper hoarding phase in the early days of this pandemic, this image probably looks rather familiar. And the title itself too, which you see on top, is also quite understandable. So we're seeing a new set of harms such as hoarding, not wearing a mask, gathering in large groups, which are being denounced both globally and very much locally. And I would argue that state-endorsed and unregulated forms of denunciation are increasingly tangled with each other. So what the police are asking citizens to do and what citizens are doing themselves tend to kind of blend into one another in ways which can also cause certain risks. So in focusing on how the COVID-19 virus brings novel security practices, also while amplifying existing ones, I want to focus on this notion of digital vigilantism, of citizens identifying, shaming, and bringing harm to each other, and the way that it's sort of amplified with these stay-at-home measures. So in the next few minutes, what I'd like to do is to briefly focus on some of the main consequences of lockdown measures on citizens' presence online. As you can imagine, they're spending much more time online and interacting via various tools and devices. I also want to briefly touch upon the benefits and the dangers of such initiatives, bearing in mind this is fairly speculative, and so I have a list of ideas in mind, but I suspect so will you as an audience. And finally conclude with some of the repercussions of online trends and offline practices and behaviors. So thinking about this distinction between the online and the offline. So putting this kind of surveillance, this kind of citizens watching over each other into context, there's a few points that I think are worth mentioning. First of all, citizens engage in this kind of surveillance in response to insecurity. And here I refer to the kind of insecurity that is produced vis-a-vis crime, but also a more general form of insecurity, such as the sense of malaise, precarity, a slumping job market, a slumping housing market, political impotence, hostile climate. So many scholars have studied the way that these forms of impotence and precarity in one's social life actually can feed into the desire to shame and to identify people and to denounce them online. So this gives people a sense of power in a context where they would otherwise be powerless. In terms of how governments and local authorities have responded to the pandemic, it's understandable, given how little we know about COVID-19, that some of the recommendations and measures have changed on a weekly basis and aren't necessarily clearly articulated or clearly enforced. In the Dutch context, issues of public gatherings and what's the threshold in terms of what's legal and not legal, as well as the whole recommendation of wearing masks, has led to some confusion, which further sort of amplifies the sort of civilian uncertainty. Of course, we've also seen cases where experts have undermined other experts and officials, again, with these points, which further leads to contention in terms of how we're supposed to conduct ourselves. Of course, this feeds into pre-existing forms of political and cultural polarization. So when looking at regions such as Europe or North America or elsewhere, we see that political and social polarization is increasingly felt, and it maps very well onto what ought to be very uncontroversial and very simple measures, such as wearing a mask. Somehow this becomes a very stark political statement, surprisingly. In terms of the broader media environment in which these conversations and debates are taking place, we see that news media such as tabloid, cable TV, and clickbait-based web platforms are also stoking the fire often. And finally, we see that at the outset of the pandemic, you have pre-existing networks such as WhatsApp-based neighborhood watch groups. These are very prolific in the Netherlands. Local social media groups, which often don't have a stated purpose, but are sort of pre-existing networks which can be mobilized or tapped into, as well as international, global-based thematic groups. So these are the contexts under which we see civilians watching over each other remotely from home. So when talking about digital vigilantism as a practice which predates COVID-19, I would consider this as a process where, in the first instance, civilians are collectively offended by something another civilian has done and tend to respond through coordinated retaliation. There's a number of examples which we can tap into. In terms of urban security and policing, some of the more prominent examples include in Dutch, the Koopschop incident, which took place a few years ago, where a group of Belgian youngsters attacked a Dutch youngster. The video footage was picked up by CCTV, by security cameras. It was shared online, and it was picked up on a Dutch social news network and reached a sort of very high level of infamy, to the point that two of the youngsters who were apprehended received a lesser jail sentence. So the judge in this case recognized that being exposed and being denounced online is a form of harm. So this can sometimes escalate into physical violence, sometimes not, but it always involves a certain form of naming and shaming. Often a loss of reputation, job loss in some cases as well. So you see the social impacts of these forms of interventions. And what's especially interesting here with the use of media is the fact that the type of mediated visibility, first of all, is unwanted. It's not sought by the person being targeted. It tends to reach an intense sort of viral spike, if successful, reaching hundreds of thousands or millions of other civilians, other users. And it tends to also be very lasting. So even if it makes it in the news, it disappears and we stop thinking about it a week from now. Often for the people who are targeted, who are sort of implicated in these cases, next time they try to cross a border, next time they try to apply for a job, a simple Google search will bring up the worst thing they've ever done. And that's something that we need to question, whether or not we want to live in such an environment. There is a number of both high profile but also very mundane cases of digital vigilantism and online shaming pre-corona. And just to give you a sense of the type of, the scope of these cases, in some instances you have organized cohesive groups, such as the Russian-based Lev Protiv, which has a logo, a business strategy, an extensive social media profile, where they go out and intervene, in this case, filming and trying to stop people who are drinking or consuming drugs in public spaces. We have an open access book on this topic, which includes a chapter from one of my colleagues on this group specifically. Of course, there's also exceptional instances of, for example, terrorism or other sort of large-scale security incidents, which also tend to trigger a spontaneous reaction from digital media users. In this case, I'm thinking specifically of the Boston Marathon bombing in 2013, which led to the wrongful identification of someone who wasn't actually, or shouldn't have been identified as a suspect. So of course, the crowds don't always get it right when they attempt to identify people. And as I said, there's no shortage of cases of people either committing crimes or doing things which are morally objectionable, which tend to lead to a lot of denunciation, both of the practice, what they did, but also the person themselves. So the case of a dentist who a few years ago shot a lion in Zimbabwe led not only to the denunciation of that person, but also led to what reporters refer to as poisoned Yelp reviews. So recognizing that this person had their own business, using review websites as a way to basically tank or to sink their business, to really bring harm to them through novel digital tools. I don't want to dwell too much on the concepts or the theories here, but just to sort of say that the use of the term vigilantism here is very curious. And if we look at some of the how we would typically understand vigilantism, it tends to be involve a certain degree of planning and premeditation, whereas now it can be fairly spontaneous. So I might witness someone not wearing a mask on the train without thinking. I might take a picture and share it with a WhatsApp group or post it on Facebook. That's not vigilantism in itself, and that I could just do in the same way that I might, see an interesting mural and take a picture. But because we're socially connected, myself and other digital media users, I then leave it up to other people to share it, to denounce it, to try to identify the person. So as soon as I upload that photo of someone in a security context, I relinquish control. We also see that vigilantism is typically understood as a citizen-based initiative that tends to work sort of in contradistinction to police. What we find with digital media is the boundaries between states, local authorities, and civilians is very much compromised. So following some riots in Vancouver a number of years ago, citizens identified the rioters, and they did this 6 months before there were any official police. But the police in this case were able to make use of this digital footage to further identify people. So the boundaries here tend to be sort of, not very evident. Likewise, when especially populist-based politicians will make use of these practices, for example, in the bottom right case, to identify teachers who are espousing so-called left-wing ideology. So tapping into this desire for people to identify and to denounce political or moral opponents. Finally, I just want to underline the fact that whereas we typically think of vigilantism as embodying either physical violence or the threat of physical violence, if everybody's supposed to stay at home and observe the lockdown measures, then you're of course going to see a greater reliance on cultural forms of violence. And here I'm referring specifically to visibility as a way to harm people. So to kind of publish, morally reprehensible behavior on their part. You can begin to understand some of the ambivalence linked to these developments of civilian-based policing. So in terms of whether or not we think it's appropriate, we can look at recent instances such as the Charlottesville white nationalist marches a few years ago, which produced these images which we would want to denounce. This might appear in history textbooks in a few years from now. We want to sort of be able to tell our grandchildren where we stood at that moment. On the other hand, you have no shortage of cases where a simple incident such as a couple of young girls getting into an argument with a server at a restaurant culminates into something much worse and damages their reputations and will follow them around, something which we might think defies proportionality. So that's one ambivalence linked to these practices. Another one, which I think is illustrated by this Twitter quote, speaks to the idea that a lot of the things that we denounce other people for doing, including in Corona times, are also practices which we might either do ourselves or that we might excuse away if it's our friends and families doing it. So this idea of calling people out for things which I might have done myself a number of years ago and might also be called out for is certainly a condition of living online. And with the lockdown and with the sort of corona-based policing we see could also be a development here as well, where if I photograph someone not wearing a mask, but then in doing so, I adjust my own mask and, it's hanging, my nose is exposed, and that's of course a big no-no as well. I could also be the target of a similar intervention. So when looking at the consequences of the lockdown measures, it goes without saying that there's a new set of offenses that citizens are now very much aware of, things which would have been inconceivable 1 year ago. So the idea of going out as a public safety risk, as a public health risk, inviting guests over, hoarding masks, hoarding toilet paper, as we remember, eating out in restaurants, even if this is legally permissible in the territory, depending on which jurisdiction we're talking about, this can still lead to people being on a more moral level upset. And given the fact that the geographic boundaries aren't very clear when you put it online, someone can photograph someone eating at a restaurant at a point in time and in a location where that was legal, but it could be presented in a way which actually obscures that context and is shown and framed in a more illegal light. Relatedly, we also see that there's a new set of personal grievances that people sort of measure against when they want to denounce and police others. So it's not just a matter that the neighbor is having guests over or that the neighbor is going out to the park, but the idea that I, as the vigilant civilian, is staying at home. And so that sort of, that inequity, that sort of, the distinction between the haves and the have-nots in terms of going out, in terms of observing these rules, also fuels this desire to scrutinize and to denounce one's neighbors. The last few months have been a learning process for virtually everybody when it comes to the use of technology. So even fairly tech-savvy people have had a crash course in Zoom, in Teams, in WhatsApp, in a number of different platforms. People who are less inclined to make use of these tools are also kind of thrown into this. So people are becoming much more adept, much more media literate when it comes to devices and platforms which facilitate interpersonal surveillance. So there's more media literacy, but this is not necessarily a good thing from in terms of public interest. And this culminates into the main consequence, which is we see people securing urban spaces remotely. So the distinction between local and digital or on and offline is further compromised. And again, none of this is necessarily new, and we've seen cases of similar practices before Corona, but Corona greatly amplifies those practices and makes them, at least on the surface, acceptable. So when focusing on the types of civilian or citizen-based scrutiny with regards to Corona, we see a number of tools have sort of hit the market at the same time and kind of compete with each other. So a lot of different practices. We can focus on the virus tracking apps. These are typically developed by governments and raise certain issues or conversations about data protection. We've seen these tracking apps in a number of different jurisdictions, and a lot of the press, when focusing on privacy and data protection, have concentrated on these apps. Rightly so, but this is only part of the picture. We also see a number of apps and initiatives, as I mentioned, where people are encouraged to provide information about neighbors who might be posing a public security risk. A number of these apps have been designed in line with Corona, but many pre-existing urban security apps and initiatives are also being used in this case as well. And what we find, in addition to these sort of top-down measures, including tip lines, et cetera, is that they coexist very easily with bottom-up measures. So either privately developed apps which perform the same function, or more clandestine measures such as Facebook groups, WhatsApp groups, other types of communities, basically anywhere where users of digital media can upload text, video, images. You're finding these practices. So it's not a question of asking civilians to do this in the interest of public security or to facilitate police activity. They're doing it independently. Now, there's a number of different distinctions we can make between these practices. And one distinction that in my research I've always tried to keep in mind is the distinction between denunciation which targets an individual, which is meant to bring harm or justice to that one person, often identifying them, and so-called more privacy-friendly measures, which are less about targeting the individual, but targeting the crime. So it's about sort of, behavior change at a more aggregate level and not so much about focusing on any single person. What I found in the last few months when focusing on these types of distinctions in these cases, especially on global platforms like Reddit, which any user can sign on to and upload content and video in a number of different thematic groups. What you find on these groups is that even when there is sort of an individual denunciation, an individual witch hunt, it tends to sort of scale up in terms of also focusing on broader categories of people. So a term that you might have heard if you spend too much time online is the term Karen. So this is a term that's sort of used typically for Caucasian women who make a fuss in public, often wanting to speak with the manager or just generally causing unruly behavior in a public space. So a lot of instances where an individual has been targeted, as you see on the left here, Karen losing her cool in Walmart. It's not that they identify this person as her name is Karen, but that she is a Karen. So this has greater implications on other people who share similar demographic information, and in this case could lead to gender-based violence, ostensibly. So this idea of even when focusing on an individual, we're often focusing on a group. And likewise, when looking at instances of mass gatherings or focusing more on sort of the larger kind of herd mentality behavior as opposed to trying to identify or denounce a single person, we still see the possibility of identifying individuals. So being able to kind of zoom in on a mass gathering such as the one on the right and saying, okay, well, I recognize this hooded sweatshirt. This is actually my neighbor. Here's his name and address. So even cases which appear to be a bit more privacy friendly, or where the stated focus isn't to identify or to bring harm to any single person, but to raise awareness, still leads to that possibility. Again, once you upload something online, regardless of what your intentions were as a police agent or as someone who's performing civic policing, it's beyond your control. So when reflecting on the benefits and the dangers of deputizing crowds, I think this is still very speculative, and I suspect you will have many other sort of benefits and dangers that you would want to add to this list. But certainly in terms of the benefits, this taps into a lot of the literature and a lot of the conversations about crowdsourcing, about getting large groups of non-professionals to do things which professionals used to do. This is often used in examples such as reviewing a movie. You don't necessarily need an art critic to review a movie. You can have 100 people do it and they might do as good of a job. So in terms of the benefits of getting crowds, getting civilians to watch over each other in Corona times, we can think of some of the more obvious benefits, such as costs and staffing. So given that many jurisdictions are dealing with budget crises, this could be seen as a cost-effective way to have not necessarily feet on the street because everyone's meant to stay home, but eyes on the screen. And of course, in conducting earlier research and speaking with police agents who sort of oversaw the implementation of digital technology, which made similar promises, this is almost 10 years ago, most police agents I spoke with were very concerned with these advantages because this is seen as an excuse to not hire full-time staff. And full-time staff still tends to be seen as important. So even these benefits, of course, can be framed in a fairly harmful way. This also taps into local networks. So being able to have people interpret what's going on in an image or in a screen in a way which reflects what would actually, what an eyewitness account would yield. So this is something that, especially in these sort of exceptional times dealing with a pandemic, can be seen as acceptable. The risk here is, are we willing to sort of tap into this local knowledge for self-policing later on? Is there going to be that kind of function creep down the road? And of course, with everything being transmitted digitally, investigations, information gathering can be sped up as well. But as you can imagine, that's not necessarily a good thing. You don't necessarily want to fail fast, as the Silicon Valley motto often states. When it comes to public security and public health, that's something actually you want to avoid. So it's cheap, it's fast, it's localized, and it's a distributed account of public health risks. What about some of the risks or the downsides? To me, at the top of this list is proportionality. So the idea that even if it's a matter of just gathering information about people who are gathering or people who are refusing to wear masks or other sorts of threats or risks, it never stays at that stage. There's always a certain desire to denounce people, to bring harm to them. And even if that doesn't manifest itself online, depending on where this data is placed, if someone were to search someone's name or to do like a facial recognition search and this footage is yielded, that will necessarily bring harm down the road. And so thinking about this issue of proportionality, I think, is key. Even for a minor incident, you can never sort of aim or estimate what kind of outcome there will be as someone who's uploading this footage. Another issue is that of competence. So there's, of course, risks of misidentification, which happens quite often. There is the sort of technical literacy. So it's, in this case, a minor miracle that we're able to make use of various tools like Zoom and WhatsApp, etc. But we often make mistakes, and that's obviously something to count on and to sort of reckon with in this context. There's also issues of data protection and privacy. So many of the people who would engage in these practices aren't necessarily well versed in GDPR and some of its more practical applications, as well as the sort of damage to reputation which can happen as a result here as well. And of course, those risks concern people accidentally misusing the technology. Of course, we know that they can also willingly abuse this technology. So hurting someone or bringing harm to a category of people because of certain prejudices, certain political opportunism, or just to promote one's own self-interest. So someone might choose to denounce their neighbor, not because their party was necessarily, in their view, a public health risk, but because they've always had a problem with their neighbor. And under these heightened measures and under this sort of extra sort of tense period in time, this is a way to bring harm to them. So the kind of information that's being brought to local authorities might carry this baggage. As I said, this is still a working list, and I'm sure there's much more we can add to it. In wrapping up, just to briefly reflect on some of the repercussions that being extremely online is bringing to otherwise offline or localized practices, as we see, and again, this is sort of furthering existing trends, the way people behave in public spaces is increasingly contested. So something as simple as going out and getting groceries, depending on how much you gather into your basket, whether or not you're wearing a mask, whether or not you're respecting social distancing, can be subject to scrutiny and denunciation. And this is something that we've grown very accustomed to, surprisingly, in the last few months. We also see that even though we're focusing on right here and now, there's also a certain degree of retrospective justice seeking. So rather than being present on the streets and watching and intervening, it's often the idea of gathering, recording data about people and intervening later on. The retrospective aspect is also interesting because it's not just a matter of the footage of someone not wearing a mask or assaulting a bus driver, but often digging up, if depending on their online presence, digging up records of statements they might have made. Let's say if they subscribe to certain conspiracy theories or certain political parties, this becomes part of the profile that we use to identify and to bring a form of social or criminal justice. We see that these practices and the kind of media literacies that are being developed, I would argue, set a precedent for conditions where it's acceptable for civilians to watch over and denounce others. And under normal times, these are the kinds of behaviors we would tread very carefully with. We don't want people to develop a sense of being an informant or, having this kind of, sometimes people make reference to sort of the Stasi as this kind of mentality where like people weren't able to sort of trust their neighbors. But under these circumstances, we're willing to rethink that a little bit. And the question is, what are the long-term developments here? And frankly, I don't think any of us knows at the moment. We see that this also becomes very much implicated in pre-existing public health debates. So urban security, policing has never existed in splendid isolation. It's always been linked up to these other kind of concerns. And that's very much the case right now, such that not only are public health authorities, the proclamations they are making, having a direct impact on these practices, but also the rise of conspiracy theories, which have these very sort of wild speculations about what it means to wear a mask or what the coming vaccines will bring. That all gets kind of culminated into this as well. If you look at the kinds of conversations and debates people are having online in relation to urban security. And as I mentioned previously, and as also is addressed to some degree in our open access book on this topic, this just tends to amplify existing forms of civil discord. So between rich and poor in terms of their ability to cope with the virus, between migrants and local residents, and between left-wing and right-wing political adversaries. I'm very curious to see how this is going to develop in the coming months and what kind of precedents and how citizen-based surveillance will look in a sort of post-corona environment. But I think that's something that we can just kind of keep an eye on. So that was my presentation. Thank you for your attention.
Grazie, Daniel.
Thank you very much, Daniel, for these analysis. That was really profound, really deep. You gave us the possibility to feel that from an emotional point of view, especially during this period of isolation. We've became judge of the other people. We used to judge a lot the other people, and we are all victims of the same threat. Please stay online because there are questions from the studio. Does he have the translation? Can you hear us, Daniel?
For a second, but I hear you again now.
Perfetto.
Okay, perfect. We have some questions from the studio, so I leave the floor to Luca and Edoardo. Thank you very much, Professor, for your interesting presentation. Here in Italy, we have a strange privilege. Every Italian student can read and study Alessandro Manzoni, which is the author of a historic romance, during an important part of the history. On the other side, we've been the first European country that was threatened by this pandemic. So we are aware of the role of the so-called factor that provoked the pandemic. What this author is writing about is exactly this kind of a situation that we're living today. It is a situation where the civilians fight with the people who are violating the regulations that are useful in order to cope with the virus and the pandemic itself. So my question is, aside from the fact that I completely agree with the fact of limiting as much as possible this civic vigilism. We were talking about this the first day. I was quoting this example not as an automatism from the population and the online community, but in the case of London, for example, after the attacks of 2004 in the Metropolitan line, we experienced this kind of situation, and the population was we tried to make the population understand, to signal certain alarming points that could be the cause of some terrorist attacks, in order to avoid what we call the paranoid feeling, a feeling that really make our relationships worse in our communities. So my question is, if aside from what you say, so limiting the procedures of these denunciations between civilians, if it is also very important to switch the communication from the public administrations. We've seen from the beginning of this pandemic that we used to take the Chinese accountable for the pandemic. After we were talking about the Europeans, after a certain period, we had different target groups. We tried to find an enemy of this pandemic. For example, the people that weren't respecting the regulations. Today, we keep as a target the young people. Well, in order to avoid this public paranoid feeling that has a cause in the social media with serious consequences, isn't it a matter of a clear communication from the public administrations?
Absolutely. I think that's the key factor, and it's certainly not enough to have clear communication from local authorities, from public health institutions. But I think that we've, in a number of countries, seen less than stellar communication at times, especially in the early stages, even with the onset of the second wave. And not that everybody is necessarily listening or giving much respect to these authorities, especially with the hold that some of the conspiracy theories and some of the sort of more populist or marginal viewpoints might be with regards to public health. But I think that's, having conversations or giving explanations about when is it appropriate to let local authorities know about public health risks and under which circumstances, but that has to go hand in hand with what not to do, and being clear about, when we refer to specific suspicious activity, these are the kind of things we have in mind, and these are the kind of things we don't have in mind. So this form of, and it is media literacy, observing the world and contributing in terms of reports, etc. This isn't just something that's taught in abstract, and it's certainly not something that's just taught to the youth, but that this is part of what it means to be a civilian. So having that kind of effective media literacy, which is linked to these exceptional times, to me is sort of the most important factor. And of course, it's not going to be enough. And where this gets especially complicated is, even if these experts and authorities aren't specialists in disinformation, in fake news, and in misinterpreting online content, so even digital forensics, they have to become experts in those domains, or they have to link up with experts in those domains. So there's multiple steep learning curves, in fact, which makes this all the more challenging.
He answered very well, and I think that we have some minutes left in order to leave the floor to Edoardo. So we harness the presence of Daniel here, so you can proceed. Thank you very much, Professor, for your interesting speech. I want to briefly know what he thinks about this phenomenon that he has talked about. and also talking about a potential risks of radicalization. And I would like to know his point of view.
Yes. I guess if I had to summarize my view in one word, it would be ambivalence. And that's not necessarily a satisfying answer, but given the fact that we're talking about such a broad range of practices, we can look at examples which I think, even if we don't agree with how it's being handled, or if we have concerns over proportionality, we can see this as socially progressive. So the denunciation against sexual abuse, sexual harassment, the steps taken against child sexual abuse online or against the abuse of animals. These are things which most people can agree with ought to be stopped, even if there's certain steps in some of these cases with some of these groups which might link up to some of the harms which I was talking about in terms of potentials for abuse or proportionality. We want to live in a world where there isn't, for example, child sexual abuse. Likewise, when it comes to the pandemic, we want to be able to prevent this from spreading. We want to keep our grandparents alive. So if at the time now it's possible to limit that spread by either denouncing neighbors who are having large parties or creating a climate where people recognize that this is not tolerated. And of course, that's a big component in terms of crime control, is sending that message out there. Then I think that's, of course, socially desirable. There's always an ambivalence because if these practices in this context are acceptable, and if people learn these skills and sort of get used to if you witness something that you think is objectionable, without thinking, you just sort of take out your camera and snap a picture. This is sort of the reflex that people have, increasingly so with the COVID pandemic. I'm left wondering what consequences that will have in the future if that becomes even more normalized. So even when these practices are used in socially beneficial ways, in ways that we can more or less agree upon, there's always going to be that potential for abuse, and there's always going to be that demand in terms of not just a broader media literacy linked up to what it means to be a civilian, what it means to be a good citizen, how not to harm your neighbors, all these sort of basic, fundamental moral and ethical training. That gets linked up to a certain amount of technical literacy, which, now we're living in a world where every few months there's like a new platform for us to get the hang of and to get used to. So as a professor now teaching via tools such as this one, it's a fairly steep learning curve. And so combining that ethical training with that sort of technological savvy, I think it can be a challenge, and I think that's very characteristic of the world we live in now.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Daniel. We say thank you to the Professor Trottier. The speech was really interesting, and the speech makes us reflect a lot on this question, because we will be the ones to reflect in the more ethical and correct and positive way in facing and coping with these emergency. We will try to be very attentive, but not so much in this sense if we're talking about denunciation. Thank you very much, Daniel. I will go on with my session. We will do a short break of a few minutes, and then we will go back with the intervention, external speech. I can see the speaker, which is already online, so thank you very much. We will come back in a few minutes, 5 minutes. We will come back at 11 online. Thank you very much. Good morning. Welcome back to the session number 4 for the European Week of Security. We talked about vigitalism, psychology, and we mentioned that the coping methods for the new pandemic with new phenomenon linked to the isolation phenomenon due to the pandemic. Welcome, Mariusz Czepczynski, cultural geography at the University of Dansk, and he is an expert in security for urban cities. His research focuses on urban cities and urban transformations. So he is a very important actor. We worked with him during this Pactusor project. So welcome, Marius. Can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you perfectly. Welcome, Isabel, Eduardo, and Luca.
Ciao Marius, è davvero un piacere.
Hello, Mario. It is a great pleasure to be live with you. We didn't have the occasion to see each other face to face, but that is a consequence, and we have to adequate to the prescriptions. We are very happy to have you here virtually, and your intervention, your speech will inspire us on very deep reflections. You will talk us about sociality and technical infrastructures. So I now leave you the floor. From the studio, we will intervene for sure for questions and confrontations. We have an hour for this debate. So I'll leave you the floor.
Thank you very much. I have a little technical problem with share screen. If you can enable me screen sharing, please, because at the moment I cannot really do this. Still not. Okay, now it is. I'm very happy to be with you all, and I'm happy to be from the brightest star on the European Week of Security map, which is Gdansk, as you can see, much brighter than Sarajevo and even Torino, and as you see, well connected to Prenzlau in East Germany. As you might have guessed, I'm geographer, I'm cultural geographer, working for the University of Gdansk, so that's how I was kind of picking up the map issues, and I would like to speak somehow related to some of the presentations yesterday when we spoke about safety and security, and I will try to focus more on public spaces, since they are especially affected with this what I called a COVID-esque, so COVID-infected places. And my major topic will be anxiety. So not really a fear. I will define it in a moment. And this is a very good example of the anxiety we are still having all the time. Like, it is a bit like the modern contemporary chances. When sorry, Elizabeth, it's not about Ms. Johnson from EFOS Network. It's like generally Elizabeth. So this is how I start all my lectures. This is how we started even here. Oh, if we can't see you, can you hear me? I have all my classes online. So this is more or less how I start and want to hear respond. So this is a part of this anxiety we are living now, with insecurity, when we don't really know what will come next. I would like to start with some distinction between security and safety. Okay, in some languages, including Polish and also in English, security and safety might mean precisely the same. But I would like to pick up one of the definitions from Merriam-Webster dictionary when when safety is related to condition of feeling of being free from risk, danger, and security, the same dictionary, among other definitions, defined it also as measures or measurements or actions or infrastructure in a broader sense, both technical and a social infrastructure to take against a risk, a crime or attack. So in my presentation, I will speak about those two levels, about feeling safe and about security actions and activities, just to make it slightly more maybe clear, because that's how I feel that we've got these two elements somehow separated. So I don't know how I'm sure the translators, the interpreters are doing it very well, translating into other languages, which might be challenging. I know it will be difficult in Polish. It's not one word you have to describe, but even if you talk about Sicherheit in German, you still have those two elements, the personal feeling and the measurements and the securities. So we spoke quite a lot yesterday, especially about more this security aspect. Daniel, a few minutes ago, spoke, I think, mostly about feeling safety or rather unsafe and the responses, social responses to this. Not that much about the security measurements. Sorry. Both of those, security and safety, is related very closely to risks, and especially now when these risks are related to both security and safety. So the weakness in security creates increase of feeling unsafe or decrease of safety, of course. So safety and security, as Bryce and Cusiamo defined, are directly proportional, actually inversely proportional to risk. Sorry about this. So this interaction between security and safety, I think this is something which we should probably look more careful and maybe analyze and study. So we've got rather developed security systems which are to detect risks or different conditions and prevent the hazard. Well, safety network is more about the perception. It's from somehow different sphere, which I will talk about this a bit later on. So my major thesis in this presentation is that we are developing a security systems, but our feeling of safety or safety network, social network, or psychological, cultural probably network, probably would be the best to say, well, is somehow neglected, as Daniel mentioned before. I will make some reference to your magnificent presentation, Daniel, because it's very inspirational, and I will definitely look for your book. So I would say this is this integration between safety system and control and security systems. So even the ongoing security measurements or approaches, like with face masks, do we really feel more safe wearing safe masks? Some of us do, some of us don't. The lockdown, so the limitations of movement, is another security structure or action. Do we feel more secure because of that? If I think it was last time when I traveled to Brussels, I saw fully armed army officers or soldiers on the Grand Place. My safety level clearly decreased. I didn't know what happened, but that's it's usually kind of a bit of less information. I'm not feeling safer in European cities, seeing the machine guns being carried in public or in any cities actually. But this disintegration is a part of the. I think many of our safety security systems, we kind of neglected this. And again, Daniel talked about this information, and also in earlier talk, you talk about this information, which might be one of the key elements. So, of course, this is rather banal that in this interconnected world, it's being very complex. It is not getting more clear. There's this hyper-connected technology that, again, Daniel spoke about, and these new technologies, I'm hardly following the new apps my students are using. So I still said, okay, call me via Skype. What? Skype? I said, okay. I'm still not on TikTok, but all of those new levels, this hyper-connection, the fast-changing technologies and societies. So there's new safety and security challenges. And what is a consequence of this hyper-connected world is that we can see it in a very short term, the same or very similar level of safety and security in New York Times Square and in the village where I'm from, 50 miles from here. So it's got almost immediate impact on very local level, on a neighborhood, on a personal level, as well as regional, national, international, or global. If we can still speak about one world. So solutions, I would rather see this as a kind of a way or a path towards improvements. I don't believe there's a clear solution, but there's a number of steps we might think to improve this relation between security and safety. And of course, it requires, as it was said earlier, a broader cooperation and also a compromise, which is very crucial in urban life, a compromise, especially in public spaces. A year ago, during the European Security Week in Nice, I had a short presentation about kind of risks management and about fear, public fear in public places. And I quoted, I spoke about this concept of Nassim Nicholas Taleb about the black swan, which is the concept that there's something unexpected, comes as a surprise, have a major effect. It's hardly rationalized. And I didn't know that 2 months later, we will have the black swan arriving to Europe in such a great speed and tremendous consequences. I have to mention that Taleb, he says that in one of his recent interviews, he emphasized that the COVID or the current pandemic, it's not a black swan. He says it's been kind of expected somehow. I'm not that sure how much it was expected, but that's what Taleb says. That don't use the black swan towards this. It's not that unexpected. Well, but I think in most of the cases, in many cases, actually it was to all our plans. Of course, I would rather meet you guys in person. I was only once in Torino. I would be really enjoying and have some network building after, and I hope I can do this. But all my plans I had for this year absolutely disappeared, or has been alternated, moderated, somehow for better, sometimes for worse. I think it was Luca who spoke earlier about the schools and about problems of e-learning. Yes, I would rather have my traditional lectures, but I have a group on urban planning at our university, and usually out of 80 students, my lectures are Monday morning. I had a group about 20, 25 being physically on lectures. I had this lecture 2 days ago. I had 61 students out of 80. I'm like, whoops. I couldn't expect it in physical world. So at least they had the computers on, they had the programs running. So on one hand, yes, there are many threats. For the other hand, you could think about their Yeah, maybe some children or students from more deprived neighborhoods, peripheral locations, they could get better access. Many of those lectures are free and online, so there's lots of opportunities. But anyway, going back to the black swan, so this is these hard to predict rare events, even if the virus itself, yes, it was possible. You could probably predict that a virus could spread globally, but at first you wouldn't predict the consequences, the lockdown. Like if somebody told me a year ago that I will not be able to travel even within my own country, or I will really struggle to buy toilet paper, I was like, nuts. I mean, I lived in a communist country, so I saw empty shelves, but I said, Jesus, not anymore. Like, come on. So this is much beyond our normal expectations. I could expect some shortages, yes, but nothing like the lockdown or like these limitations or like the actions that the Daniel talk about, this kind of Stasi mentality. Should I spy on my neighbors? Shall I? For common good, for all of us, that they walk with their dogs. Okay, we didn't have these limitations. You could walk with the dogs as many times as you wanted. So this is definitely beyond our normal expectations. So using Zygmunt Bauman's concept of liquid fears or liquid modernity, we are in this kind of liquid, fluctuant, erratic, changing situation. At first, we still don't know lots about the virus itself. Some of my colleagues, physicians, they said, yeah, probably in March, we will know more about the virus itself. Because all of our expectations, there's lots of myths growing. Like we were going relatively easily through the first wave of pandemics in the springtime, partly due to lockdown, but also they said it's also partly because most of us, we went through vaccinations. They were obligatory during communist time. So all of the older people, we've been vaccinated against different things, but it was obligatory by state. So probably they said, yeah, but now it's not getting better. Czech Republic is like in a deep mess now. And as again, Daniel mentioned, this is public policies. The answers are changing. So like, yeah, at the first wave of pandemic, we have forests and beaches closed. Like, strange. But yeah, they were closed, and I live on a coast. There were regular police drones flying over the beach. I don't know. Anyway, and then 2 weeks after, they opened forests and beaches, not the parks yet. So it's like, whew, relaxation. But of course, then I didn't want to go to the forest anymore. I wanted to go then. Then there are different national approaches. Shall we learn from Sweden? Is it really a successful case? Or maybe it's a bit too early to say. Or is it a very good case to compare Belgium and Netherlands? Close countries with a lot of similarities, at least from our perspective, pretty much different policies. And now you could see many different countries. The UK, US. I was hesitating to use this case. With trust and distrust of politicians, but we are kind of lost. Like, yeah, we still have discussion with my friends about Sweden. Is it really a good policy? But at the moment, the social cost of death is many times higher than in nearby Finland, Denmark, or Norway. So there's different security measurements. Like at first they said, yeah, mask doesn't help. Now they say, yes, mask helps. Any masks, does it really? And it comes the uncertainties about the trust. We don't know whom to trust. The politicians, if they change their opinion, of course they have the right to change their opinion because they learn more. In Poland, it's slightly more complicated because we had a presidential election. The first turn was supposed to be early May. So we were one of the first countries to open shopping malls I think it was still the end of April, very early, because the election was scheduled for the, I think, 10th of May. Then it was postponed. And then during the presidential campaign in June, the prime minister said, yeah, you don't have to wear masks, the pandemic is under control. And then after the presidential election, I said, no, we have to be prepared for autumn. No, it's pretty bad. So that's the Polish case. If you look at what Donald Trump said, you could have another discursive narrative, as I would say, as a social scientist. As also Daniel mentioned, the experts, like whom to believe, the doctors, but there are many doctors. I'm a doctor of geography. Trust me, I'm a doctor. I don't know nothing about this. But even the epidemiologists, they have different opinions. So this is, and then comes the question of the social justice and the more vulnerable groups, like the older people, the young people, the migrants. We have just introduced the 2 hours for shopping from 10 to 12. Only the senior citizens can go shopping. And there was it is a kind of, a part of the social justice, so they wouldn't mingle with the younger ones, possibly carer. But I have friends who own shops, and they said that the seniors goes like all day long. It's not like there's a big run. The shops are mostly empty, and there's quite a lot of maybe this kind of public shaming, or lots of jokes and memes going about this, about people. I saw recently a face mask, pretending a wrinkled face mask, so a mask that allows you to shop between 10 and 12. And there's a certain level of chaos, and there's a certain level of disobeying of rules, because the rules are changing and unclear. And there's growing misinformation and pseudoscience, which coming out of this liquid fears and unknown future. And then public space becomes in the core of this discourse. Public space, as I would define as cultural geographer, as a system of relations. And then public space is a place that serve us all or almost all. So it doesn't matter if it's public or private. If it serves us all, that would be a public space. And that's the very important, crucial element of urban life. I would say that the public space is the space that makes a difference between rural and urban. And I think the cities or towns became cities or towns when they start to have a public space. In the villages, it's private. And a stranger is either host or an enemy. In a public space, in urban cities, the strangers or the others shall coexist. That's very crucial for urban life. Without public spaces, we will have probably a settlements, not as cities. There will be no place for connection, for exchange of information, exchange of lifestyles. On one of the first, still during the lockdown, one of the first interviews I had with a local journalist, and she asked me what I missed most. I was like, well, actually, during the lockdown, I called more often my friends and my families, even many of them, I haven't contacted them for years, like my friends in the US or in Germany or in France. So, and also using cameras, I could see them first time after 7 years, for example, because a bit bored and, more or less everybody stayed home. But what I missed most, I missed the interaction with the others. I missed the interaction in local pubs with the people I kind of knew from seeing. I don't even remember the names. They remember mine. But of course, not the people I would ever call. But when they first opened pubs, it was so nice to meet the kind of close others, I would say. This kind of network of strangers that makes our cities. When I could go to restaurants, when I used to go or see my maybe not close friends and families, but this kind of external network essential for urban life. So this is this kind of challenge functions of public spaces. If public space is not a place for socialize and meet, it's not a place for entertainment and leisure. Okay, now sport becomes an activity, but you can do sports only on your own. So I love running. I'm generally a runner. I even did 2 marathons on my own because you run on your own, but this is rather unsocial. Market and economies, lots of businesses were aimed in the public spaces are struggling. What about political participation and representation? Okay, Belarusians are brave enough to manifest, but in Poland, we are in a rather challenging political situation going on. There's a lot of anger, but hardly. I mean, public space manifestations was the only way we can show our political representation, our disagreement, and we can't do this now. Changing transit and mobility, we went back to the cars. Okay, a little bit of cycling. I do cycle, but public transport, it's maybe dying is too early to say, but it's being very, very badly damaged. And I'm not sure if many cities, including Gdansk, the pre-COVID network of public transport will be maintained with the frequency it was before. The city financial system is getting really badly. And very important, exchange and engage, which is the place when you could see the stranger, could see, you fashion, have the lucky chance. It's not like your algorithm that tells you what you look for. Have a lucky chance to meet somebody original, stranger, engage with strangers if you'd like to. And there's this kind of recommendations for managing the public space. At first, probably the most difficult is this cross silos, synthetic, multi-level approach. I see it everywhere, including my city. It's still very hard to work more or less project focus. We learn to work in a kind of silo. In our, branch, I'm geographer, so I speak with geographers, geography, and this is history, this is sociology. We still are stuck in there. So if there's a green space management department at a municipality, they hardly collaborate with public transport management or with public participation management or with education management. So, and I think the crisis situation, it really requires to at least look beyond those borders. It is probably the biggest challenge. And then, as I had our last meeting shortly before the COVID in Edinburgh, I spoke about the public trust. That's enough. Maybe that's the most important. We have to learn to trust strangers and trust each others, which is probably difficult. And then planning is another. We have to plan. We have to think what will happen after COVID, even if the COVID-esque situation will run for another year, possibly. Some of my friends says that one of the best predictions, where we look for when the life will start to get to normal, he said, look at the wealthiest cultural institutions, like Metropolitan Opera in New York. The next season they plan in September next year, with lots of know-how and finances. That's maybe the earliest, but maybe it will be even the 2022. Nevertheless, it's nice to make scenarios and planning, even with this lots of unknown situations. But that's what we are still. And our government in Poland has absolutely no plan. They have a plan for tomorrow, probably, but maybe next week. I'm not sure about next week. But, you just build scenarios and then make a And then, of course, the scenarios can moderate. So be flexible with your scenarios, and then take a courage to make decisions, even if it's wrong. But sometimes not making a decision, it's the worst decision because it's also a decision. I will speak about this later on. And there's responsibilities, learning from others, which of course is very difficult. This Sweden, a very good case. Shall we learn from them? How much shall we learn from them? And what is the cost? Economic and social. And of course, accepting your own mistakes and miscalculations and say, okay, I think it's a part of the trust building. Okay, sorry, I said in June that it's going to be easier. No, I was wrong. I miscalculated. From the information I have now, it looks like it's going to be like this. That's accepting and admiring not admiring, but admitting the miscalculation, the mistakes. It's quite crucial. It's very difficult for politicians, but I think that's how the trust can be reconstructed or rebuilt, rather by accepting our mistakes than saying the other truth a bit later. And then I come to the major point of my presentation. I probably should speak up a bit faster about anxiety, because that's David Barlow says there's a kind of different orientation than fear. Apparently, fear is mostly based on our previous experiences. Anxiety is mostly future-oriented. So we don't know what will happen next. So I might have a fear of snakes or a terrorist attack of the mode I know. Anxiety, it's mostly of something which we don't know, which of course is much more difficult. So there is this kind of terrorist anxiety because they might use a different mode of attack, not a knife, not a car or truck, not a shoe bomb or not an airplane. They might use something else. And that's how the anxiety grows. So that's a bit different than kind of fear, which is, as I said, like, okay, I have a fear of snakes because I've hardly ever seen a snake. It's too cold in Poland. But I've heard about snakes poisoning people. And that's how I have this fear. Anxiety is precisely what is uncontrollable, probably unavoidable, unknown future. So this is like the cartoon again, with this kind of different layers of anxiety, which we went through this kind of madness and craziness and sleepiness. And then we come to this kind of social anxiety or cultural, it's a group anxiety. Because one thing is my own anxiety at my home when I'm locked down. But being locked down, using all of the social media, which I don't really use. I mean, the main social media I use is Instagram, which I think is kind of just pictures, easy, very little anxiety building platform, at least from what I observe on Facebook. Lots of humor. Most of those funny cartoons are from my Instagram. But this social anxiety is this kind of unknown future shared by a group of people. And then again, that's precisely what Daniel talked about, because it's not only my discomfort, but then you see there are thousands of us, there are millions of us. Of course, we don't know if there are millions or there are boots or they are kind of, in the internet, you never know. It might be, another Karen who is not really a Karen, but could be a boot or a fake account multiplied by thousands. So I don't really know, but I could, from my perspective, I could see, okay, there are thousands of people feeling the same anxiety. Then you could see that many people see the reality as I am. In real life, it's a bit different because you can speak with people, and you could also see and maybe argument. In the digital space, you don't really know. You just see comfort, and there's no way you can have a reasonable conversation. Oh, yes, listen, but no. I mean, Twitter is the best example, just for statements, precisely. And of course, it leads to fear of interacting with people if you think all the world is getting crazy, and might restrict the lifestyle and accumulate anxiety, and minimalizing social interactive whenever possible, real life social interactive in real public spaces. So there's this kind of anxiety cycle used by a number of psychologists. When there's a trigger, in our case, the trigger would be the virus itself, and then we've got those thoughts about worrying, catastrophing, obsession. Sometimes it goes to the stress, to the kind of physical pain, and then the coping method could be double checking, reassurance, but could be also abuse and over analyzing, and then the outcome might be the sadness, guilt, but also irritation and anger. And if you talk about the public sphere, there's a public anger. Clearly, I think it was maybe yesterday or 2 days ago when Donald Trump said that, people are just tired and angry about this mask thing. Like, oh, Jesus, don't do this. You're just tired. It doesn't matter if it protects or not, but, I'm just, angry. And then, of course, if you look, that's another my Instagram source of cartoon. We've got a number of normal anxiety about our social life, about professional life, about financial situation, and then we've got this COVID anxiety, and then we've got we had the election in the summer. Now it's a bit easier. Americans got the election now, and then we've got all of those. Oh my God, another number of anxieties, and then. It's not only me. It's not psychology, really. It's a shared anxiety, mostly through social media. I shouldn't call them social, the unsocial media or through the internet platforms. So there's a number of us who share this number of anxieties, and and then you can add a terrorist anxiety in France recently. How much we can cope as societies. So there's, of course, all those physical, biological effects and cognitive when you worry what if, and behavioral when we try to lock us at home, change patterns of behavior, and all those emotions which comes after. And of course, a part of this social and cultural anxiety is this pseudoscience looking for answers. If nobody is giving answers, possibly because there's no easy answers of the COVID situation, so somebody gives a clear answer how it all happened, and then you build who is behind. So there's this kind of changing public spaces. So there's, of course, this obvious, the Gale Institute published recently a report on public space and public life and COVID-19. They had a case studies of Danish towns. Of course, it might have been different in different countries, but I think the trends might be quite similar. So we use public space much less, especially the major commercial street and also tourist zones are much emptier. But we use the cities much more for recreation and play and exercise, even in Gdansk and Sopot. The use of public space is more or less the same, while the movements from between different points, like housing estate and a business center, significantly decreased. We move more around our neighborhood. I do shopping almost every day now because I'm at home. When I cycled to my university, I did the shopping maybe twice per week, maybe once per week. But now, since I'm at home, I can always have a fresh bread roll for breakfast, which was seldom a case before. But then I could see more and more people. There's many more happy dogs being walked a few times per day than instead of twice per day or even once per day before. So local places that being very active, like playgrounds or squares, are getting more popular than before. The core of the city, the major places like the main market squares or the party zones, they are much more difficult to follow. I don't like the phrase social distancing, because we should be speaking about physical distancing. We stay closer socially. If we have to, stand 2 meters, keep a physical distance, not the social distance. So the moral of the outcomes is there's a clear search for outdoor activities, and new activities and new forms of urban life are emerging. More children, more older people, and more women are using public space than before. At least that's what was the result from the Sgal Institute research. They've noticed that women come mostly in pairs. Men are there on their own or in the groups for plus. So it's either a single wolf or it's a wolf pack, clearly. And overall mobility has decreased. You could see it in our streets, but pedestrian movement is increasing, and especially within the neighborhoods, as I said before, but also cycling in many cities, including our cities, is increasing. So there are some results comparing before and during COVID in different locations in Denmark. So in some cities there was a smaller change, like in Copenhagen, in the bigger cities, except for like play and exercise, which is much more. But the predominant activity, like cafe sitting close to each other, has been replaced by a public bench sitting. So it's more standing and more walking than before. So we use public places differently, when we don't know if that's coming. It will come back to those activities or not. And it also depends what will happen with the infrastructure. So there's a number of these tactical short-term interventions we could think about public spaces to keep the public spaces more alive. We could see a number of cities, including Gdansk, when there is some of the parking spaces or car lanes has been replaced by sidewalks and bike lanes. We didn't really open streets, but many streets became more open. Of course, parks became more popular and there's more pressure. Of course, there's a big challenge with homeless people, which we are still having. There is this public transport which we have, and especially the shared public transport, which becomes another major problem. This is another thing which is quite important to maybe realize, that is it a choice or a decision? Do we have a choice? Is there a choice? But choice usually comes when there are a number of options we could choose. Decisions. It's much more of ambiguity and a kind of unknown. So we are making decisions. It's not much of the choices, really. So it is hard to make decisions, but that's what we are facing on many levels. My private level, on the number of my decisions. Shall I go to walk? Shall I meet my friends? Shall I keep a distance? It's not really a choice. Because there's not many outcomes which I know what will be the consequence out of it, really. So that's, again, this kind of anxiety which is growing. So there's a number of of recommendations prepared by the Black Dog Institute, which are both on the personal level, but also on a social level. And probably we should speak about it more loudly. That's avoid this unhelpful media misinformation. We are drawing in information. We are starving from wisdom or truth or recommendations, at least. But as it says here, make a plan, get prepared, make some options. I don't know. I never heard, even in Poland, any municipalities have those plans or scenarios. I don't know, 3 scenarios of what will happen, at least for next half a year, at least maybe for next year, which is very kind of clear. And then stop behavior that are feeling your anxiety, which is connected with number 2. It's usually related with this unhelpful media floods of information. Stay focused, be aware of your negative thoughts, look after your body, stay connected with others or of your close, help people, take a breath, take professional advice if you can't cope it. And that's probably, as a societies or a big social groups, cultural groups, we probably would need a society a kind of professional advice in a number of questions. In one of the research papers published by, I think, a dozen of researchers, there are those questions when we questions asked about the future. What will happen after the COVID? And since we don't really know the answers, so that again raises the anxiety on social level, on the city management level, the mayors, how to plan the next year budget if we don't know if we can run a tram or a bus, or if we can keep open a parks or might be closed. Will we see fewer people in public? Will we change what we do in public as we've changed now? What's the future of large public gatherings and political representations? Or the festivals. Just in last 2 days, many of the largest Polish city, they say there will be no New Year's celebration, public celebration. And there's lots of cultural events that are being closed. What will happen next year? Will there be still a demand? Will we still be, happy to gather in public in a big crowds? Again, probably the best thing to come with those answers is to prepare scenarios. That's my major answer, to have the basic 3 scenarios, A, B, C. One is that we will jump even deeper. We will have it even more than we had before, even more public gathering. We will have more people in public. The second kind of moderate. And the third one, we should be prepared that we will not, that we will go back to the cars as much as possible. We will stay home. Most of the work will still stay online. With the universities, yes, on one hand, I'm a bit tired being at home and having my all my work from home. But on the other hand, I'm having next semester, I'm having lectures in Tor Vergata in Rome, and next month I'm having lecture in Tübingen in Germany. So it opens new possibilities for me, and probably for my students as well. Will we need a new design for public spaces, for green spaces, civic liberties and civic rights? I think yesterday and also today we talk about this. So will the temporary transformation inspire more permanent change? Even in my university, I don't know. We have only the ongoing plan, and the university administration didn't say, are we going next semester to jump to, as it was, to banish or make it illegal to use online lectures, or we are being, go to hybrid? We don't know. But then again, it would be nice to have those answers. And that's going back to this one of the first slides when we need a little bit more coordination or connections between all the security measurements and all of those safety aspects related or resulting from number of security measurements. And that's probably the biggest challenge, maybe not for the police forces, but definitely for the local administration, for the national administration, also probably for academia. That's might be also in our task to try to connect, maybe help people to understand, and then find answers to, for example, loneliness. I talked about this, senior citizens who are especially vulnerable group, but many of them are just dying from loneliness, maybe not physically, but mentally, hardly meeting their family, not meeting friends and colleagues. Churches are almost closed. There's always a good place to meet. The shop assistants doesn't want to have a small chat, and they're on their own. I see this when I come to my 85-year-old mother. So she just talks for like 2 hours all the time about the films she saw on TV or whatever else happened. Because even I call her and my siblings call her, we have a relation. I come there once per week. Loneliness, misinformation, distrust, all of those elements which create this or build up this public anxiety. And that's, yes, we're still, making memes, trying to laugh. Even sometimes the laugh is not that. We just probably smile then laugh with a number of memes. And that's my last slide. Thank you very much for attention. I hope, Elizabeth, you could hear me and you could see me, you could see my presentation, because that's, again, it is okay. I can see Daniel nodding. So that's, thank you very much, Daniel. So I could see at least some interaction that you could hear me. But yes, well, this is another thing of this level of this public anxiety, which grows in a sense like this. Thanks a lot. Go back to the studio. Isabel, if you are still there. Can you hear me?
Yes,
Elizabeth?
of course. Ciao Mario. Sì, siamo tutti.
Hello, Marius. We're all here. So we have listened to your presentation with a lot of interest. As usual, you have then brought us into an interior and very deep world. Thank you so much for all your considerations. So you gave us a lot of hints. So these are quite very hard considerations about anxiety, but unfortunately, these are the things that we are all experiencing right now. So I believe that here in the studio, but also in the chat, there will be probably some questions. So I do not want to talk too much. So probably Luca has a question for you, and so we can go directly to some other topics. We still have another 10 to 15 minutes for Marius. So let's try to exploit this time for Marius, and so in this way, so we can proceed with our timetable. Actually, so I had 2 questions. So the very first one is very quick. This is mainly a joke. So a book on anxiety by an Italian professor is mentioning a series of German anthropologists, according to whom anxiety is a kind of projection of fear to the future, for the future is basically so the engine of evolution of our species is, of course, something that is bothering us. It's, of course, an emotion that then at long term can cause big problems, but it is also somehow one of the emotions that enabled us to survive as a human species, especially when we were just an animal that could be endangered without anxiety. So this is the first suggestion. This is the first consideration. My second consideration, I was particularly impressed because if I think of prevention to radicalization. I think that in the last years, I have shown at least 2 or 3 times some slides that presented the concepts of security and safety. Because in Italian, we do not have this distinction between security and safety, just like in English language. However, they are very useful to understand the COVID-19 situation, as you pointed out, in a very perfect way, because you gave us this wonderful portrait of the situation, a very exhaustive explanation. It's very hard to add anything else. Anyway, my consideration is to deep dive the different approach in safety and security, and also especially for terrorism and for extremisms. I think on one hand this is a particular element based on repression, based on authority. It is a top-down dimension. So this was security. On the other hand, safety is a soft power. It's much more horizontal. Its functionality is much more resilience and building trust. So I won't say in such a pandemic situation where trust is essential, if trust, as I was mentioning in my presentation, is fundamental for re-education and social reintroduction for former extremists or former foreign fighters, I think that the aspect of safety and the safeguard policies are now much more important, because trust is the most important aspect in order to fight against everything we have seen, so conspiracy, fake news, and so on. What do you think? Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Luca, for your comments. I fully agree with this positive aspect of anxiety. And we will see that some people say that maybe we will come stronger after this. And as again quoting Taleb and his black swan theory, he says one of the remedies is to if your eggs are broken, make an omelette. Use the situation. So that's what we are doing. I really hope that some of the sectors, like academia, for example, will get stronger. We might benefit, all of us. And maybe even education, when there's a big jump in digitalization. So yes, that's right. The major problem is that if it's a major social cultural anxiety, which concerns thousands, that's sometimes more challenging to come with this positive results. If it's usually was personal anxiety, when it kind of make lots of the progress, because mostly anxiety was used in psychology on a personal level. But yes, there's a possible lot of positive outcomes of any anxiety, and it is also after every major war, First World War and Second World War, we went somehow stronger, maybe not after First World War, but there were lots of positive transformations after. So maybe we will come with a number of positive transformation after the COVID. And yes, the second comment about this vertical security coming usually from the top managerial level and horizontal feeling of safety. Yeah, this is a very good idea. Thank you very much for your comment.
So for sure, the topic of trust is particularly interesting for Marius. So we could make some further considerations. I've seen there's also a question from outside. If you could just please then send it to us. I didn't have the time to read it. I apologize for that. I'm going to read it out right now. Marius, some may think that even if our technocratic structure is controlled by risk permanent control, So a real risk culture is fighting in order to emerge within our society. So what do you think about that? And if we have time, probably we can open up a debate here in the studio too.
So if I can start the debate, yeah, of course, I mean, the risk is not that bad, but the level of risk, the amount of risk, I think at the moment, this one of those graphs with this guy holding all those balls of anxiety, I think it's at the moment, it's getting quite a lot. The risk itself, it's not so bad. If we have no risk, then usually as society we behave much more risky in a broader sense. But yeah, I mean, I think a risk is always there. It's a part of our development since the beginning of civilization. Whenever we go down the streets, we take a risk. Whenever we meet somebody, we take the risk. So that's good. I think at the moment there is the higher level. You could see the sun is coming in Gdansk eventually. We've got a higher level of those cumulated risks, which build up anxiety, which might be more difficult to cope, especially with those virtual risk engines through the internet platform. So this is much more fluid risks or unknown risks, and that's what comes with anxiety. But I'm happy to listen to your further discussion.
Edoardo.
Edoardo, do you have any comment on that? Yes. I'd like to thank Marius for everything he has said, especially for the last comment he has made. I'd like to start from what he has just mentioned. Well, I'm a risk manager, so this is my job, this is my profession. So sometimes we make confusion when we talk about risk management or real risk control or preventing things from happening. It is not the same thing. In anything that we do, as Marius just said, there's always a risk margin. And even if we are good at preventing risks, and even if we feel that our situation is under control, we will never have it totally under control. That's the reason why. So we have emergency management plans, which means that I have done everything in order to manage the situation, in order to minimize risks. However, when this happens, how am I going to get out of this emergency? How am I going to get over something that's happened unexpectedly? The same thing is applicable to life. When you get over emergency, when you have combined your mitigation and control capability and the capability to act in that moment according to what you are and what you think, well, in that case, you get over it stronger. This is probably a vision that we need also to implement, something that we do not want to neglect. We do not want to underestimate our difficult period of crisis. However, we have to think of that. We know it's difficult, but as Marius was said, so if they broke eggs in the basket, probably so we can make a nice omelette instead of staring at this basket. Well, nice consideration. It's almost lunchtime, so very good. We have a very nice suggestion for our lunch. Because the risk perception as a concept is, of course, based on very many scientific and sociologic models. But it has also to take into consideration many different social and personal factors. Risk perception is not the same one according to everyone. That's why we've got the risk assessment procedure. Risk assessment can be diversified according to different pillars: personal, emotional, infrastructural, system management. This is something that Marius mentioned last time in Edinburgh, I think, in his last speech presentation. I remember that very well. If we're going to go back to that point, so this will be nice. So we have an overview over risk perception. Marius, you've got the floor.
Yeah, thanks a lot for your comments. Thanks a lot, and hello, nice to see you, Eduardo. At least half of you under the mask. So, I'm making a short comment about what you said. It's very important to remember that our aim is to minimize the risk, not eliminate, because it gives the false impression that we can control everything. No, we cannot. All we can do, we can minimize the risks. Certain risks, probably it's much harder, but our aim shall be to minimize, not eliminate, because it gives again the false impression. And then with this risk management issue, and I try to map how to manage risks, or we can also try to map how to manage somehow or how to influence the public anxiety. And again, it's all the same with this with the need for compromise. Probably I should say first that my personal freedom is limited. I would love to go outside without a mask, but urban life, social life, is all about compromise for the so-called common good, which becomes one of the major goal of our development. We somehow forgot why we do this. I'm also a strategic advisor for a number of municipalities, and I was involved in preparation of the new Leipzig Charter, which will be the kind of urban development agenda for the cities, which I think next month will be declared in Leipzig in Germany. But then they say as the major aim of development is a common good. So that's what we do. I compromise some of my freedom. I control some of my anxiety and fear for the public good, for the good of living together and having benefits out of this. I mean, I enjoy living in a city. If not, I would be living in a hut somewhere in the forest. But we have to realize, and probably it's not repeated often enough, why we do this. And that's the common good. That's for us as society, not for myself. Of course, I wear a mask also for myself, but I wear a mask for the common good, sometimes to give a good example for the others. I've noticed that when I went outside my building and saw people without masks, they put them almost immediately when they saw me. Hopefully not because I'm big, more than 100 kilos and 188 centimeters. But still, this is an element of this kind of common good, sharing responsibilities, and of course, sharing risks as well. But and again, eliminating the negative aspects of living together. And then coming back to this Daniel presentation, which is he's touching a very important, increasingly important aspect of our living together in digitalized platforms. And how much it is real. It is real for many people. People have kind of real, but sometimes the only connections and relations to others. As I mentioned, my mother, she is on Facebook all the time. That's a major platform of information. Of course, we and my brother, we sometimes do the, I don't know how is it called. It's not parents control, it's like children control. So we look through the web pages she's following, we unfollow, block some of them. So kind of I think she doesn't know it, and I hope she will not hear my presentation here now. But that's what we do. I mean, she's 84 years old, so we don't want to wind her up in her anxieties and fears. So it's not blocking. Okay, it is blocking information actually, but to minimize anxiety actually, and but important element of her social life and social relation now happens on Facebook. And she even recommended to some of her friends, her age, just, have on Facebook. I can share you some of my friends or web pages. There's not much activity of us on there, but there is this very difficult and challenging aspect, and also very dangerous, as Daniel said, because you don't really know. I tell my students, whenever you publish anything on TikTok, on Instagram, on Facebook, if it's a small and private group, don't forget you take a part in a public discourse. You don't know who will make a print screen, who will make the copy out of it. Probably your best friends or your best enemies, or you don't know. So this is also another realization that whatever we do in public space, like here I am, kind of private at my home, it is a public domain. I'm in a kind of public space at the moment, public digital space. And almost every of the platforms, so practically every, is or can be a public digitalized space. Which, of course, can be used as a social gathering. I think it was near the Easter when we made the wine drinking party with my friends through Zoom meetings, having glasses and toasting towards cameras as the second best equivalent to a personal meeting. But this is probably among the major challenge and consequence, because we might go back to the streets. We might start meeting in public squares and parks again after some of the restrictions being eliminated. But will we going out of the digitalized space really? I really enjoy some of my lectures online. If you start using this, it's much more difficult to get out of this, to go back. Even if you do the real spaces, but you will probably stay in the digital world as well. Unless that's probably a case for us educators, when we start to speak about the risks and dangers staying there. Yes, thanks a lot. I think that would be it for a moment.
Marius, ascoltando...
Marius, so we still have some minutes. I just wanted to make this consideration with you, because when I was listening to you, I tried to imagine. So you talked about trust, which is difficult to reacquire because we are masked, let's say, we are far away. And that's the reason why we cannot recognize other people's emotions, and we can also not recognize our own emotions. So it's a kind of mirror. So sometimes it's difficult to understand what we're doing. Now we are lucky, we can see you, we see your eyes, your smile. Unfortunately, this is not possible amongst us, and you're not going to see our faces, totally our smile. So it's very hard to make decisions in terms of behavior as well. So if we make a connection between these words, trust, decision, and emotions, can you say very, very quickly something about that, as a connection about on these three words, in order to close this morning session? Because everything that you have said should give us some hints so that we can improve then everything, so that we learn what we have seen in this period.
Okay. Yeah, if I may, I'm very happy that our project, the Pacte Sur project, when I'm a part of, as well as you, Eduardo and Isabel, I'm very happy it's been started some time ago, when I had the chance to meet you in person had a coffee or whatever else with all of the other guys from Spain or Scotland or Latvia and France or Belgium and Italy, and then we've started to build a network. It will be very difficult if we start the project now. I don't know. I think it's very difficult. Probably it's the question for Daniel, how to build a trust online. Because, like, if you ask me to have a presentation here, I said, yeah, sure. I mean, I know you, Isabel. I mean, we've met a couple of times. We've trust each other. There's, but that's built on a kind of, personal basis. So another of my friend who is running a number of European projects, and she says that, yeah, they are going online. It's okay with the existing projects, but starting a new collaboration, she said, yes, most of the decisions, I don't like online conferences in general, because for me, the most important part of the conference is not my presentation, but it's the coffee break, and probably even better, the conference dinner. I always take to my younger colleagues, you can skip the opening ceremony, you can skip number of presentations, never skip the conference dinner, because that's, okay, if you skip presentation, then you don't know what to talk about during the dinner, but that's how it is on a personal level, when you can say, oh, hello, I really enjoyed your presentation. So, of course, in the real world, I would have a coffee with Daniel or maybe a glass of wine after, and I would love to meet you and talk. I will probably send you an email soon, so we can have the second best contact. But online is much more difficult. It's a process of trust building, because it's never a state, it's a process. So you can every time you meet me and you ask me and you see that, okay, this guy makes sense, I can trust him because he says what he says, that it comes, there's a truth there involved, but the trust is built on accumulated truths, or accumulated honesty, or maybe accumulated sense. I like this concept of sense. So if I speak with sense number of times, you could trust me that I will not, run around my flat naked or whatever. I try to think about crazy. That's the first thing that came to my mind. Nevertheless, so that's. And online, probably yes. I mean, you could see some experts. You could see with number of his opinions, you could see, okay, that makes sense, that's reasonable, he's not lying, so the truth is very important. And then you can somehow get emotionally connected, and you can trust his opinions, really, because that's what we mostly talk about, if opinions. So you can trust my opinion, you can share my opinion, or you can see there's a sense in my opinion, common sense, shared sense. So we share senses in this sense, and emotions, of course, are anxiety. It's an important emotion with a number of positive factors. Yes. Until it reaches the high level, and then there is this positive factors disappears rather fast. You could see this in the crowds gathering. When the crowd becomes rather big, you can hardly control it. There's a number of emotions. So with the numbers, or this kind of accumulating of people, fears, anxieties, it's the risks of uncontrolled or turning towards undesirable socially aspects. If somebody would tell me 20 years ago or 30 years ago when I started my academic career, that in 30 years' time, I will have to have a lecture to my students saying what is science, what is academia, what is research, what is pseudoscience, and assure them that Earth is not flat. I would just laugh. I said, come on, it's impossible. Well, okay. I don't have an interaction with my students at the moment with my online lectures, so I didn't. I never asked them how many of them believe that Earth is flat. But it is possible that I might have some of them in my classroom. And if I see this group of people who on the internet who believe that vaccination makes autism, or G5 makes autism, or whatever else makes autism. So that's they found other gurus to trust. And of course, the emotions and fears coming with anxiety, with this unknown. So this is probably the biggest danger with all this COVID-esque situation, because it's not just the virus itself, it's all of the actions and lockdowns and policies and emotions. So that I try to create a word for this. So not blame the virus only. It is very dangerous. It's a trigger. But now we are in this kind of COVIDian, probably society and spaces, both digital and real. Maybe COVIDian is probably better than COVID-esque, with all of our fears, uncertainties, ours, and then our politicians. In many countries, we are turning extreme populism or extreme right. There's a clearly rise, not only in my unhappy country, but in many other countries, starting from the US or the UK, and I know it's France, and of course Italy and Spain as well. So then we still look for the easy answers. We still look for authority to trust, like it was the local priest who said, okay, the word is like this, the God created world. And easy answers makes us kind of less excited. When there's no easy answers, as probably it is. I mean, there's not really that much bad and good. It's much more complex. Then there's no easy answers, so there's much more difficult to make decisions, and there's much more emotions. I see the time is running. Again, when I start to speak, I'm making a short lecture. Thank you very much, Isabel, for your question. Go back to you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marius. It's been really a pleasure to have you with us until the end. I'd like to seize the occasion to say that I have received some other messages from our colleagues in the Practice Group project. And of course, they appreciated your speech and your presentation. And you've been serious, but you have made us smile with your positivity and also with your nice behavior, something that we really need to do.
I just want to, I hope it's not a message from Miss Elizabeth Johnson about my first slide. Elizabeth, can you hear us? So I hope it's from my colleagues, not from the director of FS Network. Yeah, go back to you.
Tranquilla.
No problem. I will tell you later whose message it is. Anyway, thank you again. I'd like to thank everyone. The morning session is over, I would say. So we stick to the timetable, and we're going to resume our conference at 2:30 p.m. with session number 5, devoted to digital tools, rights of human beings, impacts on human beings. I'd like to thank the speakers here in the studio, the ones that dialed in, and all of you that have followed us on the website. Thank you. I'll see you later.